Nice to hear you.
Hello,
Yeah.
sir.
Hi there. Hi. Hello.
Yeah, I can hear you very clearly, sir.
Um, okay, so we're recording the meeting, and it's nice to see you all again, some of you. This is the second webinar for Africa TESOL IATEFL ReSIG-GISIG Teacher Research Initiative. Um, Practical Tools for Exploratory Research is my title today. You won't be able to see me. Unfortunately, my webcam is not working with this computer. So I don't think that matters too much. Let's focus on the slides. Last time, in the last webinar, we were thinking about your topics, your research topics, and how to turn your topics into research questions. Because you may have problems in the classroom, you have all already sort of thought about your issues, your problems, your puzzles. And we were talking last time about how, of course, it's important to choose one topic to work on at a time in teacher research, but also to turn the problems that you're facing, the challenges that you're facing, into questions, because research questions, because that can take you forward into trying to find answers and then maybe solutions. And we also talked about different kinds of teacher research. And I explained that we were going to focus on a particular kind of teacher research, which starts off, at least, with exploring before you try to change something. So we call this maybe exploratory action research. And we're going to talk about this week about what you can do to explore, to try to find answers to your research questions. And we're going to talk about some quite practical tools for exploratory research, which are not going to interfere too much with your normal teaching. And they're not going to be too much of an extra burden for you. So let's go straight on into the plan for today. I hope that this session will help you to think about the different kinds of information, or the technical word is data in research, for answering different types of questions. Because another thing that we talked about last time, and if you haven't seen that webinar, you might like to watch the recording, which is on the ReSIG website. We also talked about different kinds of question. Maybe you remember that we talked about questions which are sort of self-questioning, questioning yourself about what you believe, really, about something. And other questions are more about asking what other people think about a particular situation, often what students think, or it could be what colleagues think about a particular issue or situation. So we could call that others' perceptions. And then another kind of research question is about behavior, about what people are actually doing, what students are doing in the classroom, or what you yourself are doing as a teacher in the classroom. So we talked about these three different kinds of research question last time. So this week, let's think about what kinds of data will help answer those different kinds of research question. I'm going to give some examples, and then we're going to turn over to you and maybe look at some of the research questions that you actually have in your mind. But that's just to remind us of what kinds of research question there might be. As I said, first kind might be exploring your own perceptions. So some of your questions might be like this. What do I mean by something? What do I think or feel? What do I think? This is you yourself. Why do I think something happens? Or what do I want to see happening instead of something else? The other question would be other kinds of questions exploring others' perceptions. For example, what do my students think or feel about something? What do my colleagues think of something? Exploring behavior, questions like this. How often does something happen, or what do I say when something happens, or what do my students do or say when something happens? Now, you may have some of these kinds of questions, but not all of them, I expect. And we're going to take some examples, I'm going to refer to this handbook, just like last week, because this is something that comes from experience with teachers in Chile, in quite large classes, teachers who are quite busy, don't have a lot of time to do teacher research. So we think these are quite practical ideas that actually work with teachers in real situations. And the book is a good place to go after this webinar to find out a bit more, or to review what we've done together. You can see the link there. Let's have one example. And maybe you can help by, this is one teacher, one of those Chilean teachers from Latin America. Her topic was, my students speak in English only to me, but not to each other. So she wanted her students to talk more in pairs or in groups. At least they were talking in English to her when she asked them questions, but she wanted them to speak more together in pairs or groups. So of course, maybe her overall hope or question was like, how can I get my students to speak more to each other? So certainly that's a kind of research question. You know, how can I? Many of you have that kind of question in mind. But what we were saying last week was, it's often best to find an answer to that question. It's best to explore the current situation, explore what's actually going on in students' minds, what's actually going on in the classroom. Sort of step back, observe, and find out what students actually think about this issue. That's why we're talking about exploring the issue, and we're talking about exploratory questions before we come to trying to change something. Fatimata, I noticed that you've raised your hand. You could write a question. Anybody, anytime you can write into the chat box. I'm not going to stop at the moment, just because of time. Later on, maybe if you have a question, you could write it down in the chat box. So, this teacher's actual research questions were like this, and she had some questions for each of these three groups. In what parts of the class do I think students speak to me? Why do I think it's important for them to speak to one another in English? These are about exploring her own perceptions, going a bit deeper into her own beliefs. In a minute, I'll ask you what sorts of data or information do you think she could use to answer these questions? So have a think about that. The other question was exploring others' perceptions, in this case, her students. So what do my students think about this? Now think about that. What kind of data could she get? What kind of information could she get to answer that question? And then the last category is to explore behavior. In pair work, which students do and don't speak in English? In pair work, when do they start speaking in English? When do they start speaking in English? That's quite positive. She thinks that by answering these questions, that will help her to answer the overall question, how can I improve this situation? So let me ask you to write some ideas for kinds of data that she could get. What kinds of, how could she get answers to these questions? I don't know. Shall we start with the last one, exploring behavior? So I'm going to write that into the chat box, and the question is, that's the question. What can she do to answer this? Just this one about what students actually do. Now, Musa, I'll answer what I think. I think that questionnaires are very good for finding out what people think about something, what people's opinions are about something. And I'm not so sure that questionnaires are good for finding out what people are actually doing, because it's kind of usually what people say about something. And if you can find a way to actually sort of see what people are doing, that's usually a better method. So can anybody imagine what this teacher could do to try to get an answer to which students do and don't speak in English? Or in pair work, when do they start speaking English? Any ideas? If not, then I will give some answers. Yeah, Anna, I think that's right. That's observations. What does that mean, actually? That means that you have to either ask somebody else to come into your classroom to look at your class from this particular point of view. Not just to look at everything that's going on, because there are so many different things going on, but you will tell that person, and it probably might be a friendly colleague who has a spare time, and that might not be easy to find someone like that. But you'll ask them, please come into my classroom. I want you just to look, to watch, and to tell me which students do and don't speak in the class, do and don't speak in English in the pair work. And also, please tell me what kinds of activity do they seem to like doing? What kinds of activity do they seem to speak in English? Which other kinds of activity do they not speak in English? That's one way. You could, is there any other way? Maybe except for asking somebody else to come into the class, to watch the class. But that's an interesting idea. So she could observe the class herself. That's interesting. I wonder how you can do that. How can you observe your own class? Yeah. We'll come back to interviews later. We'll come back to talking to them individually, because I think that that's good for what people think or what people say about what they do. But if we can actually see what they do for behavior, that's going to be more valid, more reliable. So, sure. Um, if it's pair work, okay, the teacher usually has to do something. So you could go around with a piece of paper, that's one suggestion, and take notes as you are actually doing the pair work. If you have the opportunity to video record, that's going to be a good idea. And in this case, it's necessary, I think, to video and not just audio record. There are two more ways. Another way, I mean, it's not exactly observation, but you can take notes maybe immediately after the class about what you remember observing, or take some notes as you do the class. That's what Anna was suggesting anyway. Let's think about exploring others' perceptions. What can you do to find what people think about something? Actually, I'll just say that last suggestion is, I think, quite a nice suggestion. Asking students to write about what they actually did, to trust the students to tell you, okay, honestly speaking, which activities did you speak in English, or what did you do in the activities? If you can trust them to answer that, that's a nice idea. Of course, it's what they say about what they've done, which isn't always the same thing as what they actually did. But that's a nice idea. Let's think about exploring others' perceptions, and in this case, students' perceptions. What can you do to try to find out what students believe, think, or feel about some aspect of your teaching? And very, very often, I think this is a really powerful question to ask, and I think it's possibly a question that many of you can have as a research question for many of your problems, for many of your issues. What do my students think about this? I'm going to suggest that questionnaires are certainly, as Musa suggested earlier, one possibility to let them express themselves. Interviews is another one, which I think mentioned earlier. Interviews in this case probably will not be very formal sit-down interviews. You might just be able to chat to some students. You can't get everybody's opinion by interviews, but you can sometimes go more deeply into what they think or feel because you are with them than questionnaires. That's interview questionnaire. We'll talk more about those a bit later. Sure, if you have the time, you can use tutorial time, but we don't want to have too much extra burden. So, apart from questionnaire, I just mentioned reflective writing, and this means you maybe ask a question to the whole class. You don't have to prepare a questionnaire. Give them a piece of paper. Ask them one question, maybe an open question like, "What do you think about speaking English in pair work?" It can be in their own language. It doesn't have to be in English. They write notes. It doesn't have to be sentences. And you gather all the pieces of paper. And the good thing there is you've got opinions from everyone. And it hasn't taken much time of the class. It hasn't taken much time for you to prepare a long questionnaire. So I'm quite a big fan of what I call reflective writing, which we might call like 5-minute writing or 5-minute note making. Nice idea. If you can, Amira, if you can have students making a diary, but we can maybe talk about that a little bit later. Okay, the final one I've ended with exploring my perceptions because that may not be so obvious as the others. I suggest here again reflective writing, but this time by the teacher. So it means that you yourself are writing trying to answer your questions. Now, by writing something as much as you can about these questions, you will be going deeper maybe than normal. You'll be thinking more deeply than you normally think about a particular issue, question, because writing helps us to do that. So I think that's the main kind of data. Remember, data means information to answer a particular research question. So I'm going to use the word data, although it's a technical word, but it's a good word. It means in research, it's the information that you need to answer a particular research question. So let's move on. I put quite a few different kinds of data here, and I'm not sure if you will be able to see that, but let me quickly just read out in case you're looking on a mobile phone. Under questions which are about your own perceptions, I've put 3 different ideas, and this is just to review what we've already talked about. Your own written reflections or notes. You can also be reading what other people have written, maybe on the internet. You find some things, or you find some other kind of written reflection about your issue. That can help you to reflect on what you think. You can also, of course, be talking with other colleagues about what they think, and that's their perceptions. There are others' perceptions, but it could help you to clarify what you think about your own answers to that question. Then exploring others' perceptions. If it's students, reflective writing by students, I mentioned that kind of 5-minute writing. You could have focus group discussions. It's a particular kind of interview, really, where you get a group of students together. You record it, or you keep notes as you ask them questions. You could have individual interviews or chats with individual students. That's number 6. Number 7, questionnaire. So one thing I want to emphasize today is you don't have to have a questionnaire. Many people, many teachers think, okay, if I'm doing research, that means I must use a questionnaire. Somehow it's part of our image of what it means to do research in classrooms. But you can get some useful information from number 4, for example, reflective writing by students, without having to make a big questionnaire and spend a lot of time thinking of what the questions might be. You can also remember to interviews and chats as another way. Exploring behavior or performance, these ways might help you. Lesson plans and materials, so that you can see what you've done exactly in class, what we intend to do. Recordings, we talked about that. Critical friends' notes about your lesson. Critical friend means anybody who can help you, a friend in that sense, but also somebody who will not just tell you exactly good things, only good things. But it's in this case, it's not being critical in being negative, but it's helping you to see things in a different perspective, from a different point of view. So that's observation, really. Sometimes pictures can help, as students' work or students' performance written on tasks, either written or recorded, can be useful in finding out what students are actually doing. Let's move on a little bit. I'm going to share with you a story of one teacher from Chile, and it comes from this other book, which is online and freely accessible, which I introduced you to last week, Stories of Exploratory Action Research. This teacher is called Mauro, and his topic, his interest, was seating arrangements and groupings. I'm going to tell you a little bit about this teacher's research, and after we finish, let's think about what kinds of data he got to answer his questions. Because he was particularly interested in whether he should use individual work, like in the first picture on the left. That's what he always did, and that's what most teachers at his school used to do. They would give a task and they would expect the students to work on their own in that way. But he noticed that they often would try the task, but then they would talk to each other to help each other. And he wondered whether pair work might be a better thing to do. But he also wondered whether something on the right, like on the right with a group, might be the best way of working. So he was puzzling really about what kind of arrangements or what kind of groupings would work in his class. So he thought of these questions. These were his research questions. How do my students, to explore the situation before he decided on what to do, he wanted to find out more about how my students behave when they're sitting individually. So you can already see that's a kind of behavior question, isn't it? So you can already begin to think, what could he do? What do you think he did to find the answers to that question? What kinds of data? Then, how do my students feel about individual work? He wanted to explore a bit more deeply, finding out from their perspective. So again, you can think, remember, that's others' perceptions. So what kind of data might he have got? Then actually, he did start to try out different kinds of arrangement, pair work and group work, and seeing whether they were better or not than individual work. So that's going to be maybe looking at the behavior, but also looking at students' perceptions at the same time. Okay, let's see a little bit more. So I'm going to tell you about him a little bit more, and I'm going to ask you some of these questions, especially number 1, I'm going to ask you at the end. So what he did, remember his questions, he decided that he did actually reflect a little bit on his own behavior after each class by taking some notes. And after each class, I should have said, He did. He taught. He decided to teach different kinds of class. Some of them sometimes with individual work. Sometimes with the class was done with pair work, and sometimes the class was done with group work. And after each class, each kind of class, he took some notes about um, what he had noticed about the students' behaviour, some reflections, notes. And he also video recorded one lesson. He could only video record one lesson and made some notes about the video recording. So unfortunately, he couldn't record every class. But another major thing that he did was he asked a colleague to come and observe each of those three classes. One class with individual work, one class with pair work, and one class with group work. The other thing was he did make a questionnaire and asked the students from their perspective how they felt the about the students. Let me answer one question. Umaru has asked a question: what's the ideal sample size for this type of research? I'll answer that right now. The answer, I think, is quite easy because the sample is your class, the class that you're teaching. We don't think about samples so much with this kind of teacher research because the main purpose, I think, is that we are assuming is for you to improve your teaching with that particular class. And so I think that would be the answer, perhaps. Maybe you come back to that later. What Mauro actually found was that the students seemed to work better in pairs. That was from his friend who's observing, his colleague. Also from what the students said, they preferred working in pairs to working individually. But they didn't like to work very much in groups. The reason was they felt they got distracted, they didn't concentrate so easily. So that was what he found. And it's a simple finding, but it helped him very much to decide what to do from now. So what he changed was he started to not have individual work so much, not to have group work, but to have the students working in pairs. And it seemed that the quality of the students' work got better. He benefited a lot, he said in his story, which you can read in that book. He said that he felt really that he felt empowered, as we were talking about last week, that he had managed to discover something new about his teaching and something very useful. Just a reminder that this is the kind of research that we're talking about, exploring a situation before you try to change the situation. So we can see that exactly with Mauro, that he was exploring, what happened in the individual work, what happened in the pair work, what happened in the group work, before he decided to act and have pair work. And he observed that actually that did improve the situation. That's what he reflected, and he reflected that this had improved, that had made him feel much better as well as a teacher. I think he said it, action research helped, was a kind of spark in the darkness of the system of where teachers feel they can't change anything. Please read that story if you're interested. In this book, there are 10 stories in total. Okay, just to check you're all there and check that you were listening. Just write the numbers. Thanks, Amira. Just write the numbers of what kinds of data he collected. Just the numbers from this template. These are just the same kinds of data I showed you earlier. Everybody can write their answer here if you can read that. Just test your memory. So I've put on the slide, I've put the different kinds of data that he collected. Just write the numbers. You don't have to write the actual data. How about number 1? Oh, okay. Patrick can't see at the moment, but of course later, Patrick, I hope you'll be able to watch the recording let me just tell you then that we've got some. Oh, you can't see the ETA. Okay, I'm sorry about that. Can Anna? You can see this, can't you? You can see it? Okay. Yeah. Good. So I think it's okay. Let me do it a different way then. Okay, Fatima, you can see. You said 7, which means responses to a questionnaire. That's right. He gave a questionnaire. Yeah. Nissa, yes, you're right. Actually, in the sense later on, right at the end, he did look at their performance on. Um, um, yeah, yeah. In some way, he was looking at their performance, wasn't he? But it was actually more. It wasn't so much their actual um, sort of how well they did in their work. He wasn't looking at that so much except right at the end, and he did look at that to see whether the pair work had improved their actual work. So you're right about that. I would say number 10. Yes, Amira, you said a critical friend's notes about your lesson. He was actually getting someone to watch the lesson and take notes, and that was how he looked at the behaviour at that time. Any more? He did make a recording, didn't he? Just one recording, which was number 9. But that didn't help him very much because he couldn't compare each lesson. And he did do a little bit of number 1, which is his own notes. Okay. Okay, that's Mauro. But I think this is what he did. This is the main things that he did. Um, yeah. Okay. So 9, 10, and 1, basically recording, observation, his own notes, and a questionnaire to know what students were thinking. That was his main way. Number 7, his main way to find out what they thought about it. Yeah. So he did several things to observe the behaviour, and um, he did one main thing, which is the questionnaire, to find out what students felt or thought. So his main finding, was that pairs were best for these students, and that was from what they thought, the questionnaire, but also from what he could see from that video recording and from his observation by a colleague, and they all came together, kind of to find this finding. Now, this is just to say that it's quite good to try to combine different kinds of data and not just to rely on one kind of data, if possible, because you can get different perspectives. It's called triangulation. It means that you can get different points of view on the same question, and you can confirm your finding, that it is the right finding. Let's just see a few examples of different kinds of tool for getting these kinds of data. This was the questionnaire that Mauro actually used himself, or something like this. He called it a perceptions questionnaire, and of course it's in Spanish because he didn't do it in English. He didn't feel he had to, or he felt he really just wanted to make sure that the students understood the question. So he gave them, in this case, they're quite open questions. That means he hasn't given them choices or possible options. He's got, so this was, but it's quite simple because this was what he gave them after the lesson where they were working in groups. And then I haven't showed you the other ones, but after the lesson where they were working individually, it just changed it to say, when I work individually, when I work in a group, or after the lesson in pairs, he just changed it with in a pair. So it's the same basic thing, but he repeated it, but changed the wording for those 3 different lessons. Yeah. Fatimata, you've asked me a question. I want to try to answer your questions as we go along. What number matches with video recording? Let me just go back. I think it's this one, number 9. lesson recordings. It could be an audio recording, or it could be a video recording. In this case, it was a video recording. Okay, so one way to do a simple questionnaire is to well, you could have the simplest questionnaire really, or I would call it reflective writing, would just be to say, tell me how you felt when you worked in a group, and that would be just the simplest question. Or you don't even have to make a question. You could just ask that question, write it on the board. Please write about how you felt, or even say it in their own language. Please write some notes about how you felt in group work, how you feel in group work. But this is a little bit more work to prepare. It's quite nice because it's got sentence completion. It's sentence completion. So you start the thought for them, and you can guide them towards a particular kind of opinion. But you leave it open so that you're going to get their true feelings. And there are 5 questions: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 questions. And he's going to get some very interesting interesting answers from this. Next time, Shan will be talking with you about how to analyze this kind of data. That's the question you may have. You get lots of different opinions. Well, how can you analyze? How can you see what is the main opinion of the students? But let's not talk about that today. We're just talking about how to get the students' opinions. This is another example of a questionnaire, a simple questionnaire, because that's what I'm emphasizing, that we need to think simply with teachers like yourselves with not very much time. We need to think simply about simple questions. So here, this teacher was interested in what students think about writing, because she felt they don't like writing, or she wanted to find out more what they think about writing in English. So you can see it's similar because it's simple questions with some space there. What do you like writing about? What do you dislike writing about? How do you feel when writing in English? What kinds of text do you write better? What would you like to write about? And simple questionnaire there. And it goes straight to the heart of this teacher's topic, which was how can I improve students' motivation to write? She felt they were not really interested at all. So first she had to explore what they actually feel and think about writing. Sometimes teachers are very surprised, actually, if you actually ask them. You may think that they're not motivated, they're not interested, but you find answers from these questions, and you have to be a little bit brave, don't you, to ask students. But you're sometimes pleasantly surprised by what they say. This is just another example of a questionnaire, which is this is more like closed questions. Closed questions means the answers are given. They can only answer agree or indifferent or disagree. There's no space here for their own, for other opinions. They can only agree or disagree or be indifferent. These are harder. This kind of questionnaire is harder to make because you have to do all the work of finding these items. English is a very difficult language. This one is about motivation, about English in general. That's what the teacher is interested in. Number 3, English frustrates me because I don't know anything. Number 4, I think it's impossible for me to learn English. Number 5, I think English will take a long time to learn. So I want to say that this kind of questionnaire is maybe what you might expect to make. It's the kind of questionnaire you may have answered yourself with closed questions, maybe often quite a lot of closed questions. Of course, it will help you to count and to say this number of people think this and this number of people think this. However, they're harder to make because you have to think of all these different items. They also don't necessarily go as deeply into what students really think as the kinds of questionnaire that we just saw, because these are open questions. The students can write about their true feelings, what they themselves think. You don't have to assume, you don't have to predict what they're going to say, because how can you know what students are going to say unless you find out, So I'd say Yeah, this is a possible kind of questionnaire, but do think seriously about that kind of more open questionnaire, like this, or like the one that Mauro used, or even just the one question and have the students writing at the end of the class. Um, I'm going to give you just a few tips about different kinds of research method, and then we're going to move over to your questions, some of your questions. So with questionnaires, I'll just simply read through what it says. Keep the questions simple to avoid confusion and misinterpretations. Use the type of questions that will give you the information that you need. So always think about what are you really interested in finding out. It could be useful to have a combination of open questions like these ones and maybe some closed questions. Then you can definitely count numbers with this kind of closed question, but you can also go deeper and find out what students are really thinking with open questions. You must keep the questionnaire focused on your issue and not going into all sorts of different issues, and keep it brief. Sometimes they can be very long questionnaires, but you want it to be brief and not interfere too much with your teaching. And also, the longer it is, so the harder it's going to be for you to make a questionnaire. Ask someone, like in your case, your mentor. Your mentor can check your questionnaire and give you feedback. And always, if possible, you can ask a student from a different class to answer it to see if it's clear or not and give you some feedback. Just some tips about interviews. Decide the questions that you want to ask before your interview. Don't try and think on the spot. Plan enough questions, just in case people are not going to speak very much. But allow the people to speak as much as they can. Don't interrupt them too much. Try to ask open questions and not leading students to a particular answer too much. And plan them well in advance so that everybody knows when they're going to happen. Observations by somebody else. You have to tell that person who's going to observe you. You have to tell them what they want, what you want them to focus on. And for this, you could design a kind of observation checklist. I'm going to show you an example in a minute. In other words, make sure that you agree that colleague knows exactly what you want to focus on in your class. If you're a recording lesson, you must be advising the students that they're going to be recorded, and prepare the audio recording advice properly to make sure there aren't any technical difficulties. Consider where to put it. If you're recording your own voice, then it can be near you. If you're recording students, it should be maybe nearer to them if it's audio recording. And again, planning is very important, planning when it's going to happen. Now, I said I would show you a sample of an observation checklist. This one was sort of asking the teacher. The teacher was interested in what we call classroom management, how the students got into groups, how quickly they got into groups, how students followed instructions. It was sort of quite a lot of different things, really. So this is what the teacher prepared, prepared for the observer. Some questions, and the teacher could write notes in these boxes, but also they could just tick the boxes. You don't want to have too many different things for the observer to focus on. And in fact, you could just ask them, please focus on such and such. Please focus on how many students do pair work, how interested students are in the pair work. You don't have to produce a checklist like this. You can but make sure you give them the topic, make sure they know clearly what they have to observe and take notes. So I thought it'd be a good idea now. We have about maybe 15 minutes left. How about if we look at some of your exploratory questions? I hope you don't mind if I share, maybe Ita. Ita, you are here. Do you mind if I share your questions, which I received from your mentor? Um, anyway, Ita, these were your questions. What classroom speaking activities are motivating for students? And that's great. Okay, thanks. Also, I think I might want to share Patrick's your questions a bit later. Is that okay with you? Okay, that's great. Okay, Ita. So here are your questions. Just think about the first one. Um, what classroom speaking activities are motivating for students? And in this case, I wonder if you've already thought about what you're going to be doing to. You can put on your microphone if you like, Ita, or we could write to each other. Um, can you switch on your microphone? There's a little thing at the top of the screen. Um, if you can do that, if not, don't worry. I'll talk with you. Ita, what classroom speaking activities are motivating for students? Motivating is Ita. I meant if you want to talk with me now, there's a little picture at the top of your screen, maybe, which is a microphone. If you click on that, we can maybe talk. You may not be able to do that. Um, don't think so. Okay, let me say what I think about your question, Ita. Ita, is that you? Hi, Ita. Hello. No, it's not working. Ita, what I think about your question, your first question, is that motivating is something that's inside students. Motivation is what is about students' feeling or students' attitude, isn't it? So if we go back all the way back to those um, different kinds of data, it's about others' perceptions. It's about what somebody else thinks. What's in this case, what students think. So I would say any of number 4, 5, 6, or 7 would be good for this question. Reflective writing by the student at the end of a class, or um, a focus group discussion, or an individual interview, or a questionnaire. So these are all very appropriate for that first question. Um, have you thought which one you might use? No, I can't hear you. It does. So maybe you could write if you. What I think is that motivation is about opinions or attitude of the students. So probably reflective writing number 4 would be good. Having the students tell you at the end of a class which activities they enjoyed or didn't like. That would be a very simple thing maybe to do. Or just to give their opinion about activities that you did in the class that day. That would be quite a simple thing and a very useful thing, and not too much burden for you. Certainly, yeah, reflective writing. That's what I was thinking. You could certainly have chats or with groups of students or with individuals. That's number 6. Or if you want to, you can do a questionnaire. But I think that reflective writing is quite effective. One thing, just for all of you, one thing that I've found, one way of making a questionnaire is to do the reflective writing first, to get all of the students' opinions. And of course, you don't know how many people think a particular thing. So you can always take different opinions from what the students have said and put those into a questionnaire, make those the different items so that you find out how many people think a particular thing. A kind of questionnaire like we had before, with a closed questionnaire. But these different items, you don't have to think of them yourself. You can take them from students' writing and just copy and paste, take them directly from what students have written, so that you know that these are some things that some students think, and you can ask how many agree or disagree. And that's one thing that is quite a useful, simpler way of doing questionnaire, making a questionnaire. So Patrick, thanks for, you said that you don't mind sharing your, good, thank you. So Patrick, you don't mind us sharing your questions. I guess you find that you feel that students engage in chit chat during class discussions, and that I think you mean that they're not focusing on the topic that you give them to discuss, that they're going to talk about about other things like TV programs they've watched or something about their social life. Is that right, Patrick? I guess that's what you mean. And of course, you would like to eventually get them to stop chatting and participate actively on the topic that you've decided. So that will be later in exploratory action research. That will be what we'll come to later. You'll find the answer to how you can get them to focus better during discussions by exploring. That's why I'm going to focus on this first question. If you can find out why they do it, and maybe even find some answers from students, like what they think could stop them from doing it, that could help you to eventually find a solution. It might be necessary as well, because you might try all kinds of different things in the kind of action research, but you wouldn't actually know whether that was going to work, or it would be quite kind of random as to whether it would work or not. So it's good that you've got this question: why do students, exploring the reasons? Again, when we talk about why, this is behavior, but it's the reasons for behavior, and the reasons for behavior we can only find out, it seems to me, maybe you disagree, but by asking the students themselves for their reasons. I don't see any way really that we can find the answer to this question without asking the students. So I think that we're going to have the same kinds of data, and it's often the case that the others' perceptions, students' perceptions, is a very common focus for research. So I would say again that asking the students themselves to write a little bit about this. Let me say one thing though. You think that they engage in chit chat, and you might be right. I think it's always worth actually finding out a little bit more about what they actually do, so their actual behavior, if possible. So you could be asking them, as Anna suggested earlier, you could actually be asking them, first of all, how much do you concentrate, how much do you actually talk about the topic in discussions, and how much do you talk about other things in discussions? And then, of course, don't ask the students to write their name, because that would just make them not tell you the truth, maybe, or worry at least about how you're going to judge them. But just that's something actually I should have said earlier about reflective writing. If you want honest, true opinions in reflective writing, probably best not to ask them not to write their names. But in that way, if you ask that question first, so how much of the time do you think you are spending on topic and off topic? And then, if you speak off topic, what is the reason why you go off topic? You might find some useful answers just by that kind of those two questions for reflective writing. Of course, you could do chats or interviews, but you have to have a very good relationship, I guess, with your students if they're going to open up to you about something where their behavior may not, they know that it's not something that you would approve of. Questionnaire, again, anonymous questionnaire might be a good thing to do, maybe after you've done some reflective writing. So those are my thoughts about that particular topic. And eventually, I hope that you'll be able to find answers to how you can improve the situation by by exploring that. So I think I'll stop there. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them for 5 minutes. But what we've done today is to look at those different kinds of research questions, trying to match different kinds of data to different kinds of research question with examples and examples from this book on the left. You can go and read more if you like. I would recommend chapter 5 in this book on the right about different ways of getting data for your research questions. So that was my webinar today. Thank you for listening. And if you have any
Thank you very
questions,
much.
you can write them.
And
We've got about 4
it
minutes
was
left.
really a good, nice session for all of us.
Thank you, Patrick. I'm glad that
And
was so useful for
if
you.
you have, if any
Idas too.
questions from the participants, would you like to answer?
Okay.
Yeah, and I think some of the students asked, some of us asked a question about the sampling. How many participants do we need for this kind of research? A participant asked that. Would you like to talk about this? Okay. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, I answered that already earlier. That basically we're not really thinking about samples because we're thinking about our
I
own
think
students. So
they meant
we're
this
thinking of
by
all the
saying
students,
sampling.
really.
You
We're
know.
not choosing.
Yeah.
If you're thinking about how many students to interview, for example,
Yeah.
that's a difficult question. I mean, the questionnaire should go to all the students in your class, the class that you're worried about, concerned about. I don't personally agree with the idea or like the idea of having a control group and a group that you're doing something new with, which many teachers think is what we are doing. To compare whether you do something with one group is better than what you do with the other group, for example. But so we're really just thinking about our group of students, and so we're doing it with all the students. We need to know what all the students feel really, and interviews can only get some of the students' opinions. That's why we always have
Sometimes
to
I get
try
such
to check
questions. Teachers teach
whether
3-4
other
different
students in the
classes,
group agree
and
or not,
they
and the
say,
questionnaire
"Can
can be
I,
useful for that, I think, with all of the
experiment this
students.
in every class that I teach?" And maybe that was actually a good question for me, because I said it depends on what you want to do. I mean, if you have a short questionnaire which you can apply it to all students you're teaching and different levels and see their reactions, and then you have the opportunity to compare and contrast your students. But if it is a qualitative aspect, then it depends on how much time you can invest in data collection, and how much how you can embed your data collection process into your courses, because you cannot feasibly do all of these in your classrooms. Maybe they need to decide in which class they want to do it, which might be a good option.
Yes, Kanan, and for me, the main thing is that you're doing this in order to understand a particular class, a particular group of students, and improve your practice with that particular group, And so why go and do something with other classes? You might want to do something different with other classes where you have a different kind of issue, maybe. So Musa, let me think about your question. Musa, I think I can't remember your topic, but I think this relates to what we were just talking about. That I guess there is a particular issue that came up for you in a particular class, and so it seems to me a little bit sort of. But I think this is for you and your mentor to discuss, rather than for me to judge, because your mentor knows better your situation. But just seeing what you've written, it seems a little bit artificial to take students out from the normal class and put them in a separate session. It sounds a little bit like something a scientist might do to experiment on people. But this teacher research is really very, very natural, and sort of we're trying to solve an issue in that particular normal, natural situation, which is your class. So I can't say that I can judge you or judge whatever you do. I think you need to talk about it more, but that's just my initial feeling. So thanks for your reaction there. And you don't need, yeah, just, you can't do research with too many different classes all at once. I would focus on one class, all of you actually, and see how it goes. And then maybe in the future, you could, if you find it useful, you can do something with other classes. Different class, yeah. I kind of agree that different tools and different research questions even will suit different classes. You have different problems in different classes.
Thank you very
maybe.
much.
Right. Thanks.
Okay. Bye, everyone. Thank you very much
So
for
thank
your
you, all of you,
participation.
and I wish you all the best
In the third session.
for your
Keep in touch.
pleasure.
Bye.
Bye bye.